Hi everyone, my name is Judy Hoffman. I am an assistant professor at Georgia Tech, and today I'm going to be talking to you about maximizing transferability when learning in simulation. Let's start by thinking about one of the common and collective problems that our community deals with, that of autonomous vehicles, and trying to be able to understand the world that you see around you. So here's one example data set. And one thing that you'll notice is that within just this data set that looks at imagery around a single city in the US, we notice a lot of variation. This comes from different weather patterns, times of day, as well as different parts of the road, whether or not you're on the freeway or driving around a neighborhood. So if we want to start to understand these road scenes, we have to be able to tell the computer, tell the algorithm what it is that we want them to do when confronted with a road scene. To do that, we take the approach of annotation. So given a road scene, if you're trying to solve a task such as understanding what every pixel corresponds to in the scene, well, then you need to provide labels with every pixel. And this is tedious and extremely expensive. It can cost between $10 and $12 to do this for a single frame. And if we want to be able to do it in such a way as to scale up to deploying vehicles across the country, across the world, and for them to be able to handle all the variation that this particular task may encounter, well, then we're going to have to annotate a lot of images. This tends to be prohibitively expensive, and so instead, a lot of people want to be able to turn to simulators. Now, classically, we had simulators that maybe would be object-centric, like ShapeNet, or would focus on having a 3D model of a particular object of interest so that you could render it under different viewpoints and really understand that object, usually for the purpose of being able to manipulate it when observed in a new environment. More recently, we've seen works like the Carla simulator, where we're able to render an entire street scene and control things like weather pattern. Separately, a different data set collected still images from the Grand Theft Auto game, leveraging some of the work that had been done in realistic rendering for the video game industry. And then, of course, there are a number of embodied vision simulators, like the habitat simulator used for the challenges associated with this workshop. And these simulators allow you to be able to interact with the environment and control some of the next frames that you may encounter. But the real question is, if we're going to be training on simulated data, how well does that data actually translate to what we might encounter in the real world? So to understand that, one way would be to train a model, let's say a semantic segmentation model, on a scenes like from the left, this Grand Theft Auto game, and then evaluate the performance of that semantic segmentation model on scenes from the right, the cityscape driving data set. And when we do that, we can take a test time image like this cityscapes image here. And we know that the ground truth annotations for this image correspond to these colored labels here. But unfortunately, the model that was trained on just the simulated data suffers from a lot of inaccuracies. In particular, even things like the road down at the bottom is very confused with buildings and vegetation. And important objects like this pedestrian are almost entirely missed. So clearly, training and simulation alone is not enough. We have to take a more active approach if we can hope that our models will transfer from simulated to real environments. And this is going to be the focus of today's talk. And one of the big ways in which the literature has focused on closing this sim to real gap is in focusing on learning better representations. Now, what does this mean? Well, in some styles of approaches, when training on simulated data, the work, like domain randomization, seeks to augment the simulated training dataset with as many possible variations as might be encountered at test time, so that the model can learn to be invariant to those stylistic changes and not be fooled by any subtle stylistic changes that are encountered at test time. Another similar work, the Augmented Autoencoder from ECCV 2018, sought to add an auxiliary learning objective that asks to place objects in their canonical form. So you could take an image as input and use the augmented autoencoder in order to produce a canonicalized version of that object in pixel space on the output. And yet another style of approach, which goes beyond sim to real, is that of learning better representations overall. And in this case, many people focus on tasks like learning disentanglement, learning to separate out the stylistic information, these factors of variation that should not influence your discrimination of the content. And beta VAE is just one such approach. Now, separately from learning strong representations that are more naturally transferable across simulated to real environments, is learning to transfer quickly. So even if your model is not ideal when learned in simulation, we want to be able to quickly adapt it. So one such way that people look at this is by setting up or mimicking this fast transfer type environment by playing the meta-learning game. Another such approach is by trying to match the statistical properties of the two different environments using techniques from domain adaptation. And most recently, a lot of works have focused on image-to-image transfer to close this sim-to-real gap. In today's talk, I'm going to be covering two different recent works that focus on either learning better representations or learning to transfer quickly. Learning representations will be through latent canonicalization, and learning to transfer quickly through an implicit modularization of the overall modeling framework. So to get started, let's first look at sim-to-real representation learning through latent canonicalization. This is joint work with Aur Litani, Srinath Sridhar, Leo Guibas, and Ari Morkos. And in this work, what we seek to do is look at this question of how do you handle all the different factors of variation that one might encounter at test time, and observe the fact that trying to augment your training data, even in simulation with all these factors and all combinations of these factors, may be intractable. So just think about the self-driving scenario. Here we have an input image. And if we want to think about just a subset of the factors of variation that you might encounter in this application, you might think about where you are in the world, what are the weather patterns like that day, what time of day is it, whether or not you're in a city center or out in a rural part of the city, and what are the other environmental conditions on the road, whether or not there are pedestrians in the scene, whether or not there are other cars in the scene, whether or not there was an accident. The list goes on and on. So the key idea in this work is that we're going to learn a representation in such a way that we force it to be able to factorize along these different types of variations that you might encounter in the real world. So how do we do that? Well, we start with our raw input images. And perhaps just like standard reconstruction-based learning objectives, we might want to noise the input to avoid overfitting to the particular data used during training. Next, we're going to learn an encoder. This is the part of the model that's going to be able to process input images and learn the latent representation. We'll take this latent representation and we're going to regularize this latent representation according to some end task. In this case, it might be digit recognition. Now here's the key part of this model. We'd like to learn a representation, a latent code, as it were, which is linearly manipulatable along different axes of variation. So in the case of digit recognition, perhaps some of the factors of variation may be font size, font color, rotation, background color, shear, and font type. And so we are going to learn a separate transformation for each of these types of factors of variation. But these transformations are going to be applied in latent space. And we'd like to be able to combine these factors of variation. And regardless of how we've combined them, we want to be able to decode into the images that have been canonicalized only according to the factors of variations that we have applied. So if, for example, we take the input image and apply no factors of variation, as is done in the bypass channel, we'd like to be able to reconstruct the original image. If we've placed the latent code through a sequence of transformations, namely the third red row, which goes first through the font size and then through the font color, we'd like to be able to decode that latent representation into a 7, which has the same background color as initially shown and the same font type, but has been canonicalized according to font size and according to font color. So you see that the third row there shows a 7 that is now white, which is the canonical font color that we used. So altogether, we're going to have a learning objective that asks us to learn a representation that is discriminative according to, in this case, digit prediction, but more generally according to some downstream task, while at the same time is able to be manipulated through learned transformations, which are composable, in order to canonicalize across different factors of variation. And these are supervised through image space losses. And once we do that, we can start to examine different experimental paradigms. So in the case of learning to recognize digits in Street View house numbers, we're going to have a Street View house numbers digit simulator. And this simulator, again, is going to provide canonicalizations across different factors of variation, like font size, font type, rotation. And given a particular input image, we'd like to be able to perform different latent transformations which result in different output canonicalized images. Now, once we do that, we can start to evaluate results on digit recognition on real Street View images. So here we're going to look at Street View accuracy as a function of the number of labeled samples that we have in the Street View real-world data set. And first, we're just going to look at some performance of baselines. So the first that we're going to consider is a simple autoencoder. Autoencoder is one of the backbone components of our model, and so we need to be able to understand how this would perform on its own. And it performs something like this. When you train an autoencoder on the simulated data and then use that representation as initialization for training with just a few labeled target samples, you get below 25% at the 10 sample range, and upwards of 55% in the 1,000 sample range. Another model that has been proposed for learning reusable representations is VAE, and that one does a little bit better in this sim to real transfer scenario. Now, surprisingly, beta VAE does a little bit worse, and this was true across multiple different settings of hyperparameters in beta VAE. Now, finally, RoteNet does the best out of these 4 baseline models. And RoteNet is a model that is learned using a multitude of auxiliary tasks across being able to predict the various rotations that have been applied in image-based transformations to, in this case, the simulated images. So this is the most transferable of these simple baselines. So we're going to compare with RoteNet alone on the next slide, and now consider more sophisticated baselines. The first being the autoencoder, together learned with a classifier. So again, we're trying to do digit recognition here, and it turns out that when you train with a task loss in simulation, it is surprisingly more effective at transfer to the real application of the task. Now, VAE in this case didn't help over the autoencoder. But our latent canonicalization model, which is a combination of an autoencoder with a classifier, but importantly, added together with the ability to do latent canonicalization, performs the best consistently. For one more example, we can look at understanding using ShapeNet, how to recognize different objects, and then evaluating the performance of that on ImageNet images. So to do that, we look at these categories that are shown here. We take the ShapeNet models and we render them with very unrealistic backgrounds and foreground different patterns. But we do this just to showcase that the simulator doesn't have to be entirely realistic in order to really leverage this model. And so what we do first is we compare against that RoteNet baseline that worked very well in the previous scenario, together with the autoencoder that's trained along with a classifier, in this case to recognize the ImageNet objects. VAE with a classifier again performs about comparably to the autoencoder with classifier. And then finally, the latent canonicalization model outperforms all of them. And this just showcases that with the latent canonicalization, even when training with a fairly low fidelity simulator, you can really leverage the simulated data in order to learn quickly from few examples in the real image database. Up next, I want to move on and talk about SplitNet, which is now a model that's focusing on sim-to-sim and task-to-task transfer for embodied visual navigation. And this is joint work with Daniel Gordon, Abhishek Kaden, Devi Parikh, and Dhruv Batra. And the problem setup studied here is that we'd like to be able to learn in an embodied environment, and we'd like to be able to learn jointly both how to recognize inside of these embodied scenes, but also how to perform a particular task. And the key idea of this work is that if we can implicitly modularize these two goals, one of visual recognition and one of navigation, then we're able to disentangle these two aspects of learning and more effectively transfer both across different visual environments as well as between two different embodied tasks. So to begin with, we proposed the split net architecture. And this architecture learns from an input image to extract salient visual information that can then be decoded using a number of different task decoders. Of course, there's going to be the source embodied task decoder. In this case, that's point-to-point navigation. But the key that we add here is that we augment together with auxiliary tasks, both visual-based auxiliary tasks like depth prediction, as well as motion-based auxiliary tasks like ego motion prediction. And the reason we do this is because it gives additional information by which we can learn to adapt the shared visual encoder given a new environment, which we'll see next. But first, we want to evaluate how well this model performs when trained using the auxiliary tasks. And we're going to evaluate it across 3 different simulated environments. And we'll measure our performance using both success, which just means how frequently you make it to the goal, as well as SPL, which incorporates information about success together with how far away you were or how long a path it took to get to the goal. Now, baseline models include things like standard end-to-end training using our backbone architectures, and these are the overall SPL and success numbers across these 3 environments. The important detail here is that when we train together with our auxiliary losses, we get substantially improved performance, going up in the case of Matterport 3D from around 52 SPL to 71 SPL. And so training with these auxiliary losses is actually beneficial already on its own, regardless of any downstream transfer performance evaluation. But of course, the reason why we introduced these auxiliary losses was actually to be able to enable faster transfer. And first, we're going to look at sim-to-sim transfer. In sim-to-sim transfer, we consider having 2 different simulated environments, and this means that they're likely to have different visuals. We're going to keep the end task the same, point nav, in both of these cases. And we're going to ask how quickly can we adapt between the 2 different environments if we have the same point nav task in mind. And to do that, we're going to take our split net model and we're going to take our new target input images and pass them through the entire model. We're going to use our auxiliary task losses as well as our embodied task loss. But the key here is that we would like to be able to adapt the visual encoder without necessarily needing to adapt all of the task decoders. And if we can really isolate the portion of the network that needs to be adapted in response to just a simulator change without a policy change, well, this will reduce the number of parameters that we need to update, which may allow us to adapt faster. So we freeze the task decoders and allow the losses to backprop through them without modification, and only providing modification to the network once it reaches the shared visual encoder. Once we do that, we're able to evaluate our performance across the different simulated environments, as well as across different quantities of target data. So the first set of experiments looks at having no target data. So this would be simply looking at our model out of the box and how well it performs. And we know that it already outperforms the source-only model that was trained end-to-end. Next, we can examine what happens if we have just one episode to train with. And there we see, again, a huge improvement. Then, finally, as our last experiment of sim-to-sim transfer, we can examine having 10 or all of the available episodes, in this case 61 or 72, depending upon the transfer experiment. And in all of these cases, there is a substantial improvement indicating faster, more effective transfer in the case of using the split-net architecture as opposed to end-to-end learning. And again, this is really just a difference of having these auxiliary losses as well as manipulating the gradients in order to have an implicit modularization of the learned components of the model. Next, we can think about the converse, task-to-task transfer. In task-to-task transfer, you remain in the same simulated environment, but now are confronted with a new task to learn. So instead of point nav, maybe you need to do a task like scene exploration. And so the idea here is that because you're in the same visual environment, you shouldn't need to update your visual encoder at all, and you only necessarily need to update your embodied task loss or your embodied task decoder, not even the visual or motion auxiliary task decoders, because those haven't changed. And so we can freeze everything in the network and train just with the new task in order to update or fine-tune the decoder layers that have to do with the new target task. This is very similar to what people would normally do in standard fine-tuning, where you freeze a portion of the network and only train a few new layers. The difference here, of course, is that the model was trained initially with all of the auxiliary tasks. And so the shared visual encoder is more generalizable than a model that had been trained on point nav alone. So what we see is that the split net transfer experiment allows faster and more effective training, even as the number of episodes improve. So here we have number of explored cells in the y-axis versus number of training episodes in the x-axis. Because the task that's trying to be learned is exploration over time, seeing that you explore more cells is success along this task. So finally, to close what we've covered in today's talk, we're looking at this task of closing the simulation to reality gap. We've covered two core strategies. The first being how to learn transferable representations from simulated data, and the second, designing mechanisms for efficient transfer to real data. And an effective solution that will really get closer to fully leveraging the simulated data and making it work most efficiently and effectively in the real environment is going to need to have a combined effort between these two styles of approaches. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to my talk. I'm sorry we couldn't all be there in person. I'm sure the workshop will have a lot of interesting virtual conversations nonetheless. And I want to take a moment to thank all of my co-authors without whom none of this work would be possible.